He swore he'd never love again after tragedy struck, burying himself in duty and the law. But when a mysterious new teacher arrives in town with secrets of her own, everything changes. Can a broken heart learn to trust again? And what happens when her past threatens to destroy them both? Find out in this emotional frontier romance that's capturing hearts everywhere. If you're loving these stories of second chances and courage, hit that like button, subscribe for a new chapter every week, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more of these timeless love stories to life. The morning light seeped through the wooden blinds, painting amber stripes across Colton Reeves's weathered desk. His fingers traced the tarnished badge pinned to his chest, the star that had become both his shield and his prison. 5 years had passed since he'd buried Sarah beneath the old oak at the edge of Redwater, and still the ghost of her laughter haunted every corner of his office. Outside, the town stirred to life. Merchants rolled out barrels of goods, and the blacksmith's hammer sang its familiar melody against hot iron. Colton's gaze drifted to the small frame on his desk. Sarah's smile forever frozen behind dusty glass. He had long abandoned the ritual of polishing it daily. Some dust, he'd learned, was meant to settle. "Sheriff?" Deputy Miller's voice broke through the silence. "Stage is coming in. New school teacher aboard." Colton nodded without lifting, his eyes from the papers before him. Another stranger in Redwater meant nothing more than another name to remember, another potential problem to solve. His world had narrowed to the boundaries of his duty, the weight of his gun, and the comfort of predictable routine. "I'll be there," he said, though he felt no urgency. The town would welcome its newcomer, whether he stood witness or not. The leather of his chair creaked as he rose, adjusting his hat with practiced precision. The mirror on the wall reflected a man he hardly recognized anymore, eyes that had forgotten how to see beyond the horizon, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile without conscious effort. At 42, Colton Reeves had become a walking embodiment of the law and nothing more. He stepped into the harsh sunlight, squinting as the world sharpened around him. The stagecoach approached from the east, trailing dust clouds that glowed golden in the morning light. Something in the air felt different today, a subtle shift in the wind, perhaps, or a peculiar stillness that preceded change. Colton would later remember this moment as the invisible line between before and after, the last moment he stood on familiar ground before the earth shifted beneath his feet. The stagecoach wheels groaned to a halt, settling into the well-worn ruts before the Redwater Hotel. Dust motes swirled and danced in the afternoon light as Colton watched from beneath the brim of his hat, arms crossed over his chest. He maintained his position on the boardwalk, separate from the small gathering of townsfolk who'd assembled to welcome the newcomer. When she emerged from the carriage, it wasn't with the flourish he'd expected of an Eastern schoolteacher. There was no elaborate hat, no fussing with skirts, no dramatic surveying of her new surroundings. Instead, she stepped down with quiet grace, one gloved hand accepting the driver's assistance. Her dress, the color of prairie sage, seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight rather than reflect it. Colton noticed her posture first, straight but not rigid, as though she carried an invisible weight with practiced dignity. Her face, partially obscured by the modest brim of her bonnet, revealed itself gradually as she turned to thank the driver. Features too subtle to be called beautiful in the conventional sense, yet they assembled into a countenance that arrested his attention. Her eyes, when they briefly swept across the gathered crowd, were the precise shade of storm clouds gathering over distant mountains. Mayor Holloway bustled forward with his characteristic enthusiasm, a man perpetually campaigning though elections were far away. "Miss Kensington, welcome to Redwater. We're delighted you've arrived safely." "Thank you, Mayor." Her voice was lower than Colton expected, with a quiet assurance that carried across the street without effort. The journey was quite educational. Something in her tone suggested layers beneath the polite response. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps humor. Colton found himself stepping forward without conscious decision, drawn by the subtle puzzle of her expression. "This is our sheriff," Mayor Holloway announced with a proud gesture. "Colton Reeves keeps the peace better than any man in the territory." Evelyn Kensington's gaze met his, direct and unflinching. Most newcomers regarded him with either excessive deference or poorly concealed wariness. She offered neither. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I hope I won't require your professional services, but I'm pleased to make your acquaintance nonetheless. Miss Kensington." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so familiar it required no thought. "Welcome to Redwater." Their interaction lasted mere seconds, yet as Colton watched Mayor Holloway escort her toward the schoolhouse, he realized his hand had risen unconsciously to his badge, the talisman he touched when unsettled. Something about Evelyn Kensington's steady gaze had reached past his carefully constructed walls and left a fingerprint on glass he'd thought was solid stone. That night, for the first time in years, Colton dreamed not of Sarah's death, but of her life, of a conversation they'd shared on the porch of their small house, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass. In the dream, Sarah smiled at him and said something he couldn't quite hear over the chirping of crickets, something that seemed important to remember. He woke before dawn, the echo of her unheard words lingering like the scent of rain after. A storm has passed. For 3 weeks, Colton observed Evelyn Kensington from a distance. Their paths crossed with the predictable frequency of two people sharing a small town's limited geography. A nod exchanged on Main Street, a brief acknowledgement at Sunday service, parallel browsing of shelves at Harmon's general store. Redwater embraced its new schoolteacher with characteristic enthusiasm. Children reported home with stories of maps unfurled across classroom walls, of poetry read aloud with expressions that made ancient words breathe again. Parents noted improved penmanship and suddenly curious minds. Even Mrs. Westover, who had initially sniffed that education was wasted on farming children, admitted that her grandson had started helping with the store accounts unprompted. Colton catalogued these details without admitting his interest, gathering them like a man unconsciously collecting smooth stones during a meandering walk. His patrols increasingly included the schoolhouse, though he justified this as sensible vigilance. The building stood somewhat removed from town after all. Prudence, not curiosity, guided his steps. On the fourth Tuesday after her arrival, Colton found himself lingering outside the schoolhouse as afternoon lessons concluded. Children burst through the doors like water through a broken dam, their energy undiminished by hours of learning. He waited until the flood subsided to a trickle, then a stillness, before approaching the open door. Evelyn stood at the blackboard, her back to the entrance as she erased the day's lessons with deliberate strokes. Afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating chalk dust that floated around her like luminous snow. The simple movement of her arm, up, across, down, contained a rhythm that held his attention. "Seems you've won them over," he said, remaining in the doorway. She turned, clearly unsurprised by his presence. "Not all of them, Sheriff. Tommy Blackwood remains unconvinced that reading will serve him better than following his father into the mines. Smart boy, sees no point learning what won't feed him." Something flickered across her expression, not offense, but perhaps disappointment. "Is that why you're here? To reinforce the futility of education in frontier life?" Colton shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the presumption in his visit. "No, ma'am. Just checking that everything's in order. Building's old. Roof leaks when the rain comes heavy from the north." "I see." She set the eraser down, wiping chalk dust from her fingers with a small cloth. And does your concern extend to all public buildings, or is the schoolhouse receiving special attention? The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most. Town women approached him with either flustered deference or transparent matchmaking schemes. Evelyn Kensington did neither, regarding him with calm assessment that made him acutely aware of the dust on his boots and the stubble on his jaw. "Just doing my job, Miss Kensington." "Of course." She nodded, a slight smile softening her features. "Well, since you're here, would you mind moving that bookcase? It arrived yesterday, and I've been waiting for sufficient masculine fortitude to relocate it." The request, practical, impersonal, somehow eased the tension that had gathered. Between his shoulder blades, Colton removed his hat and set to work, aware of her watching as he shifted the heavy oak piece across the room. "There," he said when finished, replacing his hat. "Anything else needing masculine intervention?" "Not today." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same unnerving directness. "Thank you, Sheriff." He nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the threshold. "Tomorrow my students will learn about law and justice. Perhaps you might spare 15 minutes to explain your work. Children learn best from those who live what they teach." The invitation hung in the air between them, simple on its surface yet laden with unspoken significance. An opportunity to step beyond the orbit of polite distance they'd maintained. 2 o'clock, he said without turning back. "I'll try to keep the grimmer details appropriate for young ears." Her soft, "I appreciate that," followed him into the afternoon sunlight, settling somewhere beneath his ribs like a seed planted in long dormant soil. Colton arrived at the schoolhouse at precisely 1:55, his badge polished for the first time in months. He'd rehearsed a brief speech about maintaining order and the importance of rules, distilling his 17 years of law enforcement into digestible lessons for young minds. What he hadn't prepared for was the wave of anticipation that swept through the classroom when Miss Kensington announced his presence, or the forest of raised hands that sprouted before he'd spoken a single word. "Is it true you shot Blackjack Thompson dead in Silver Creek? Have you ever been shot yourself? Do you sleep with your gun under your pillow?" Miss Kensington's soft clearing of throat silenced the barrage. "Children, we discussed appropriate questions for our guest. Sheriff Reeves isn't here to satisfy morbid curiosity." Her eyes met his with a hint of apology. "Perhaps you could explain why we have laws in the first place." 15 minutes stretched to 30 as Colton found himself drawn into genuine conversation with the students. He sidestepped glorification of violence, focusing instead on the protection of the vulnerable and the complex balance between letter and spirit of the law. When Tommy Blackwood asked if he'd ever let someone go who'd broken the law, Colton hesitated before sharing a carefully edited story of a hungry man who'd stolen bread. "Sometimes justice needs mercy to be complete," he concluded, surprising himself with the sentiment. As the children filed out for their afternoon recess, Evelyn approached with a leather-bound volume in her hands. "You have quite a gift, Sheriff. I haven't seen Tommy so engaged all term." "Boys his age respect a badge and gun," Colton replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "Nothing special about the man wearing them." "I disagree." She held out the book, a collection of essays on law and philosophy. "I thought you might find this interesting. It shaped my thinking on justice considerably." Their fingers brushed as he accepted the offering. The momentary contact, warm, unexpected, sent a jolt of awareness through him that he immediately tried to suppress. "Bit sophisticated for school children," he observed, turning the volume in his hands. "It's not for them." Her eyes met his with quiet challenge. "It's for you." The presumption should have irritated him. The schoolteacher, assuming the sheriff, needed education on his own profession. Instead, he found himself nodding, tucking the book carefully under his arm. "I'll return it when I'm finished." "No rush." Good ideas deserve time to take root. She glanced toward the window where children played in the yard. Will you join us again? Perhaps next week. The children would appreciate it. The children. Not her. If duty allows, he said, reaching for his hat. As he left the schoolhouse, Colton realized he'd spent the afternoon without once thinking of Sarah or touching his badge for reassurance. The recognition came with a stab of guilt, followed by something less familiar, a whisper of possibility that felt dangerously like hope. That night he opened Evelyn's book and read, until dawn streaked the eastern sky with pale fingers of light. November arrived with biting winds that scoured the streets of Redwater, stripping leaves from trees and color from the landscape. Inside Harmon's general store, Colton fingered the silver music box, its delicate engravings catching the lamplight. The shopkeeper had received it last week, an item too fine for most local tastes, shipped by mistake among more practical goods. It plays a waltz, Harmon explained, demonstrating with a careful turn of the key. Notes spilled into the air, crystalline and precise, a memory of refinement that seemed out of place among bolts of plain fabric and sacks of flour. Colton hadn't intended to purchase anything when he entered the store. He'd merely sought refuge from the wind while completing his evening rounds. Now his fingers traced the contours of the box with unexpected longing. He thought of Evelyn's classroom, how she'd transformed its barren walls with maps and pressed flowers, creating an oasis of beauty amid practicality. "I'll take it," he said, surprising himself. "Need it wrapped." Harmon's eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions as he packaged the music box in brown paper and string. "Shall I have it delivered to the schoolhouse?" "No." Colton's response came too quickly. "I'll deliver it myself." The package sat on his desk for 3 days while he invented and discarded explanations. A thank you for her classroom visits, which had now become a weekly occurrence, a token of appreciation for her work with the children. The truth that he'd seen something beautiful and thought immediately of her remained unacknowledged even to himself. On the 4th day, wet snow began falling at dawn, thick flakes that muffled the town in white silence. By noon, Colton had resolved to return the music box to Harmon, requesting a refund or store credit. By dusk, his boots instead carried him to the small house behind the schoolhouse where Evelyn had taken up residence. She answered his knock, wrapped in a shawl, surprise evident in her widened eyes. The scent of cinnamon and apples drifted from behind her, and a book lay open on a small table visible through the doorway. "Sheriff, is everything all right?" Colton removed his hat, suddenly aware of the snow melting on his shoulders. "Everything's fine. I was passing and thought—" He extended the package awkwardly. This seemed like something that belonged in a schoolhouse, for the children. Her eyes held his for a moment too long before dropping to the package. "How thoughtful. Would you like to come in while I open it? The fire's warm, and I've just made tea." The invitation hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Crossing her threshold meant crossing a boundary both had carefully maintained, the distance between professional courtesy and personal connection. Another time, perhaps. He placed the package in her hands. "Good evening, Miss Kensington." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him on the 3rd step. "My father had one very similar. He would wind it each night before telling me stories of faraway places." Colton looked back. She stood in the doorway, snowflakes catching in, her hair, the opened package revealing the silver box in her hands. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "Thank you." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the gift's true meaning, of the door it had opened between their separate worlds. Colton nodded once, unable to find adequate words, and continued into the gathering darkness. Behind him, faintly, he heard the delicate notes of the waltz drift into the snowy evening, following him like a memory of something not yet experienced. The first Sunday of December brought unexpected sunshine, a brief reprieve from weeks of grey skies and intermittent snow. After church service, Colton found himself accepting Mrs. Potter's invitation to her traditional Sunday dinner, an event he usually avoided with carefully crafted excuses about duty and paperwork. His change of heart had nothing to do with overhearing Evelyn accept a similar invitation moments earlier. At least that's what he told himself, as he changed into a clean shirt and polished his boots to a mirror shine. Mrs. Potter's home buzzed with conversation and laughter when he arrived, late enough to avoid appearing eager, but early enough to secure a seat at the main table. Evelyn sat across from him, engaged in conversation with Dr. Harrison about a scientific journal they both apparently followed. The setting sun through the window caught in her hair, revealing threads of amber among the brown. "Sheriff Reeves rarely graces us with his presence," Mrs. Potter announced, passing a platter of roast beef. "We must be especially honored today." "The town's been quiet," he replied, accepting the platter while avoiding Evelyn's gaze. "Gives me a chance to be sociable." "Sociable?" Mayor Holloway laughed. "There's a word I never thought to hear. Associated with our good sheriff. Must be Miss Kensington's influence. I've heard you've become quite the regular visitor to the schoolhouse." Colton felt heat rise in his neck. "Just doing my duty to support education." "Indeed." Evelyn's voice held a note of amusement. "The sheriff has been most instructive. My students now understand that justice is not merely punishment, but restoration of balance." "Restoration requires admission of wrongdoing," Reverend Palmer interjected, "something increasingly rare in our modern age." The conversation shifted to broader philosophical ground, allowing Colton to retreat into observation. He noted how Evelyn's hands moved when she spoke of ideas that inspired her, how she listened completely when others talked, how she deflected personal questions with such grace that few noticed their inquiries remained unanswered. After the meal, guests migrated to the parlor for coffee and Mrs. Potter's famous apple pie. Colton found himself by the bookshelf, examining titles without registering them, when Evelyn appeared at his side. "Escaping the interrogation?" she asked quietly, nodding toward Mrs. Tremaine, who had cornered the new telegraph operator with pointed questions about his marital status. "Strategic retreat," he corrected. "Self-preservation. A wise tactic." She selected a book from the shelf, opening it to reveal pressed wildflowers between the pages. "Mrs. Potter preserves more than food, it seems." "Sarah used to do that." The words escaped before he could contain them, the first time he'd spoken. His wife's name aloud to Evelyn. "Flowers, leaves," said it was like keeping summer safe through winter. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the delicate preserved petals. "She sounds like someone who found beauty in ordinary things." "She did." Colton swallowed against unexpected emotion. "Always said I missed half the world because I only looked for problems to solve." Was she right? Usually. He managed a small smile. "About everything except her choice of husband." Evelyn closed the book carefully, returning it to its place. "I doubt she would agree with that assessment." The quiet certainty in her voice, the defense of a woman she'd never met, the implicit recognition of worth he kept hidden, undid something tightly bound within him. For a dangerous moment, Colton wanted to tell her everything. About the raid that had taken Sarah while he was tracking stolen cattle 3 counties away. About returning to find only ashes and a grave. About his failure to protect the one person who had seen beyond his badge. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Seems like Mrs. Potter is preparing to force musical performances from her captives. I should check on the jail before Deputy Miller decides the prisoners need entertainment." Understanding flickered in Evelyn's eyes, not just of his excuse, but of his retreat from vulnerability. "Of course, thank you for the conversation, Sheriff. Colton," he said impulsively, when it's not official business." "Colton," she repeated, testing the shape of his name. "And I'm Evelyn, when we're not being official." He nodded, strangely affected by hearing his name in her voice. As he made his goodbyes to Mrs. Potter and the other guests, he felt Evelyn's gaze follow him to the door, not with the speculation common in a town starved for romance, but with something more valuable: patience. Later, walking beneath a sky scattered with stars, Colton realized he'd spoken more about Sarah in one brief exchange with Evelyn than he had in 5 years of enforced solitude. The recognition brought not pain, but a curious lightening, as though setting down a burden he hadn't known he still carried. January arrived with bitter cold that froze the creek solid and drove wolves down from the foothills in search of food. Colton's patrols extended to outlying farms, ensuring livestock remained protected and families had sufficient wood for their stoves. The work consumed his days and often his evenings, limiting his visits to the schoolhouse to brief, practical exchanges about building maintenance and weather conditions. Evelyn, meanwhile, had been invited to join the town council's education committee, the first woman granted such recognition in Redwater's history. Her proposals for expanded curriculum and a lending library met with surprising support, particularly from business owners who recognized the advantage of a more literate workforce. Their paths crossed less frequently as winter deepened, yet Colton found himself more aware of her presence than ever. He noticed the lavender sachet she'd hung in the post office to combat the smell of damp wool and tobacco. He observed her giving reading lessons to Mrs. Cardoza, who had never learned letters in her native Portugal. He overheard snippets of her conversations with Dr. Harrison about advancements in medicine and science, revealing depths of knowledge that stretched far beyond basic education. On an unusually mild Saturday in late January, Colton encountered Evelyn outside Harmon's store. She struggled with an unwieldy package while attempting to maintain her footing on the icy boardwalk. "Allow me," he said, stepping forward to relieve her of the burden. "Sheriff," she relinquished the package with visible relief. "Thank you. Mr. Harmon assured me it wasn't too heavy for a lady to carry, but he failed to account for the ice." "Harmon wouldn't recognize a lady if she wore a sign around her neck," Colton replied, earning a surprised laugh that transformed Evelyn's features from merely pleasing to genuinely beautiful. "That's uncharitable," she scolded without heat. "He gave me a discount on these reference books when I explained they were for the advanced students. Then I withdraw my criticism." Colton adjusted his grip on the package. "Shall I carry these to the schoolhouse for you?" "If it's not too much trouble." They walked in companionable silence until reaching the creek crossing, where the narrow bridge required single-file passage. Colton gestured for Evelyn to precede him, then followed, carefully conscious of the precious cargo in his arms and the woman who had trusted him with it. "I saw you received a letter from Boston yesterday," he said as they continued toward the schoolhouse. The observation revealed more of his attention to her life than he had intended to expose. "Yes." Her tone cooled slightly. "From an old friend. Must be nice to maintain connections to your previous life." Evelyn's pace slowed. "Some connections are better left in the past, Sheriff." The deliberate use of his title, a step back from the intimacy of Colton, signaled a boundary he had inadvertently crossed. He nodded, accepting the correction without comment. At the schoolhouse, he set the package on her desk while she lit the stove to chase the chill from the room. Watching her precise movements, the careful striking of the match, the gentle closing of the stove door, Colton was struck by how little he actually knew about the woman who had come to occupy so much of his thoughts. "Why Redwater?" he asked abruptly. "Must be dozens of towns closer to Boston that need teachers." She straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt before meeting his gaze. "Distance has its advantages when one wishes to start anew. Running from something, A flash of something, anger, fear, crossed her face before settling into composed determination. Aren't we all in some fashion? Not running, staying put with what happened. He hadn't meant to reveal so much, but her question had bypassed his usual defenses. Perhaps that's its own form of flight, she suggested quietly. Remaining frozen in grief can be as much an escape as constant movement. The observation, gentle, yet unerringly accurate, struck too close to truths he'd avoided confronting. Colton reached for his hat, suddenly eager to retreat to the familiar territory of duty and distance. Books delivered. Anything else need doing before I continue? My rounds. Evelyn regarded him steadily, accepting his withdrawal without comment. No, thank you. The students and I are grateful for your assistance. He nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. That music box, do you still wind it? At night? Every evening, she replied after a moment's hesitation. It reminds me that beauty can travel great distances and still remain intact. Something passed between them then, an acknowledgement that whatever histories lay behind them, something new was being written in their careful exchanges and deliberate silences. Colton touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that had become more than mere courtesy. Good day, Evelyn. As he stepped into the winter sunlight, he realized it was the first time he'd used her given name aloud. The syllables lingered in his mouth like the taste of something long forgotten yet instantly familiar, the flavor of possibility. February brought the worst blizzard in Redwater's recorded history. For 3 days, wind howled down from the mountains, driving snow through every crack and crevice, creating drifts that swallowed fences and transformed familiar landmarks into alien sculptures of white. Colton established emergency protocols immediately, moving elderly residents to the hotel, distributing stored supplies from the town hall basement, organizing shifts for snow clearing and firewood duty. Sleep became a luxury, measured in minutes, rather than hours, as he traversed the town through near-zero visibility, checking on isolated homes and ensuring no one froze while huddled in darkness. On the third night, as the storm reached its crescendo, Deputy Miller reported that no one had seen Miss Kensington since the previous morning. Her absence from the community shelter had been attributed to her likely relocation to the Harrisons' home nearby, but a check with the doctor's wife revealed she wasn't there. Fear crystallized in Colton's chest as he strapped on snowshoes and gathered emergency supplies. The small house behind the schoolhouse stood vulnerable to the northwestern wind, partially sheltered by a stand of pines, but far enough from town to be easily overlooked in the chaos of community response. "I'll find her," he told Miller, his tone leaving no room for argument or offers of accompaniment. This was personal, though he wouldn't have admitted it aloud. The journey should have taken 15 minutes. It took nearly an hour as Colton fought through snowdrifts that reached his chest in places, navigating by memory and instinct when visibility dropped to mere feet. The cold bit through his layers, numbing his face and fingers despite thick gloves and a scarf wrapped around his lower features. By the time he reached Evelyn's small house, twilight had faded to full darkness. No light shone from the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. Dread propelled him through the final yards to her door, where he pounded with a gloved fist. "Evelyn, it's Colton!" Silence answered, broken only by the moan of wind through pine branches. He tried the door and found it unlocked, not unusual. In Redwater, where trust outweighed caution most days. Inside, darkness greeted him, along with bone-deep cold that suggested the fire had died hours ago. "Evelyn!" His voice echoed in the stillness as he fumbled with matches to light the lantern he'd brought. Yellow illumination bloomed, revealing a small, neat space that bore unmistakable signs of Evelyn's personality. Books stacked on every surface, dried flowers arranged in simple vases, a half-finished letter on the small writing desk. A soft sound from the bedroom doorway pulled his attention from these details. Evelyn stood supporting herself against the frame, wrapped in what appeared to be every blanket she owned. Her face, usually composed, showed clear signs of illness. Flushed cheeks, bright eyes, hair disheveled from restless sleep. "Sheriff," her voice rasped with confusion. "Why are you—" She swayed slightly, and Colton moved without thinking, closing the distance between them to support her before she could fall. "You're burning up," he said, feeling the heat of fever even through the layers of blankets. "How long have you been sick?" "Yesterday, perhaps. The days have blurred." She leaned against him with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I thought it would pass." "Stubborn woman," he muttered, helping her back to the bedroom. "Why didn't you send word to town?" "The storm." She gestured vaguely toward the window, where snow continued to batter the glass. "Didn't want to endanger anyone." The simple selflessness of her explanation struck him with unexpected force. How many people would have risked others' safety to ensure their own comfort? Yet here was Evelyn, willing to suffer alone rather than place another at risk. "Well, I'm here now," he said, more gruffly than intended, "and I'm not leaving until this storm breaks and you're back on your feet." She looked ready to argue but lacked the strength. Instead, she sank onto the edge of the bed with a sigh that seemed to come from her very bones. "The fire. I'll handle it. You rest." For the next several hours, Colton worked methodically to transform the cold house into a haven against the storm. He coaxed the stubborn stove back to life, melted snow for fresh water, discovered tea and preserved soup in her small pantry. When the main room had warmed sufficiently, he helped Evelyn relocate to the sofa, where she could benefit from the stove's direct heat. "You're surprisingly domestic for a lawman," she observed, as he arranged blankets around her. "Sarah taught me," he replied, the words coming easier now than they once had. "Said no man over 30 had any business not knowing how to care for himself or others." A wise woman. Evelyn's eyes, bright with fever, studied his face. "You loved her very much." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Still do, in a way. Different now, though. Less like drowning, more like carrying something precious but heavy." She nodded as though his fumbling explanation made perfect sense. "That's how grief transforms, I think. From consuming fire to banked coal, still warm, but no longer. Burning everything it touches." The insight, articulating what he'd felt but never expressed, created a moment of connection more intimate than physical proximity. Colton busied himself with adjusting the blankets, uncomfortable with the vulnerability, yet unwilling to retreat from it entirely. "You should eat something," he said finally. "Keep your strength up." As the night deepened and the storm continued its assault, they existed in a world reduced to the circle of warmth and light within the small house. Evelyn's fever rose and fell like the tide, bringing periods of lucidity interspersed with restless half-sleep. During one such feverish episode, she spoke of Boston, of a fiancé who had seen her education as an entertaining novelty until she expressed opinions that contradicted his own. "He wanted ornamental knowledge," she murmured, her head resting against Colton's shoulder as he helped her drink water. Enough Latin to impress his colleagues, enough literature to discuss at dinner parties, but never enough substance to challenge his assumptions. "His loss," Colton said simply. She smiled faintly. "That's what my father said when I broke the engagement. Before he—" Her voice trailed off, eyes closing as exhaustion claimed her again. Colton remained beside her, one hand resting lightly on her blanket-covered shoulder. Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind's howl diminishing to a whisper as dawn approached. Inside, something equally powerful had shifted, the careful distance they had maintained giving way to truth shared in darkness and vulnerability. When morning broke clear and blindingly bright, Colton knew that whatever lay ahead, there could be no return to the separate orbits they had previously traveled. The storm had altered their course irrevocably, drawing them into a shared gravity that would either bind them together or tear them apart. Spring arrived early that year, bringing renewal to Redwater after the harsh winter. Green shoots emerged in the town square, and the creek swelled with snowmelt from the mountains. Colton found himself whistling as he made his morning rounds, a habit long abandoned that returned without conscious thought. His friendship with Evelyn had blossomed following the blizzard, evolving into something the town observed with poorly concealed interest. Sunday walks after church became routine, as did regular chess matches in the schoolhouse after lessons. Concluded, they maintained propriety, always in public spaces, conversations focused on books and ideas rather than personal feelings, yet something undeniable had taken root between them. "You're good for him," Mrs. Harrison remarked to Evelyn one afternoon as they selected fabric at Harmon's store. "Haven't seen the sheriff smile so much since Sarah was alive." Evelyn adjusted her shawl, uncomfortable with the observation despite its kindness. "We're friends. He's assisted greatly with the school's security improvements." "Of course," Mrs. Harrison replied with transparent disbelief. "Just friends discussing window latches and door hinges. How fascinating that must be." The exchange, while typical of small-town interest in potential romance, hinted at the broader reaction to their growing connection. Most viewed it positively, the respected sheriff and the dedicated teacher forming a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Yet not everyone welcomed this development. Town Council President Edward Blackwood, Tommy's father, and owner of the region's largest mining operation, had initially been among Evelyn's supporters. Recently, however, his attitude had cooled considerably. Twice he had questioned her curriculum at council meetings, suggesting her teachings about workers' rights and economic fairness were unnecessarily provocative for frontier children. Colton observed these challenges with growing concern, particularly as Blackwood's criticisms found fertile ground among certain conservative elements of the community. While most parents appreciated Evelyn's dedication, some began questioning whether her Eastern education made her unsuitable for preparing children for Western realities. "You should tread carefully," Colton advised during one of their chess matches. "Blackwood has influence beyond his council seat. His mines employ half the men in town." Evelyn moved her bishop with deliberate precision. "Should I teach only what powerful men find comfortable, then? History sanitized of struggle, science without uncomfortable questions." "Not saying that." He countered her move, capturing a pawn. "Just suggesting diplomacy might achieve more than confrontation." "I've tried diplomacy." Her fingers lingered on her queen, considering possibilities. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't object to my methods. He objects to my independence. He offered to guide my professional development last month." "Meaning?" "Meaning he proposed marriage as a solution to my headstrong tendencies." She placed her queen decisively. "I declined." Jealousy flared unexpectedly in Colton's chest, not just at the proposal itself, but at the realization that others might view Evelyn as available, might attempt to claim what he had not yet found courage to reach for. "Blackwood's been widowed less than a year," he observed, studying the board to avoid meeting her eyes. "Seems hasty." "Indeed, particularly as his interest emerged only after learning of my inheritance." She glanced up, catching his surprised expression. "My father's patents provide a modest income. Not wealth by Boston standards, but significant here. You never mentioned money before." "Because it doesn't define me." She sat back, arms crossed, "but it explains certain attention I'd rather avoid." Understanding dawned as pieces connected in Colton's mind. Blackwood's sudden opposition, whispers he dismissed as ordinary gossip, subtle warnings from Deputy Miller about asking questions regarding the schoolteacher's background. "Has Blackwood threatened you?" He kept his voice neutral despite the anger building beneath his composure. "Not explicitly." Evelyn's gaze dropped to the chessboard. "But his son mentioned that my predecessor left town suddenly after disagreeing with his father. The boy seemed to think it amusing, a cautionary tale about defying authority. I remember John Mercer supposedly received an urgent letter calling him home to Illinois." Colton had never questioned the abrupt departure, assuming personal matters had intervened. Now doubt crept into his recollection. "I'll look into it." "Be careful." Evelyn reached across the board, her fingers briefly touching his wrist. "Blackwood wouldn't appreciate scrutiny, especially from someone close to me." The contact, warm and fleeting, along with the implicit acknowledgement of their special connection, sent a current through Colton that momentarily displaced his concern. When he looked up, he found Evelyn watching him with an expression that mirrored his own unspoken feelings. Possibility tempered by caution, hope shadowed by fear. "Your move, Sheriff," she said softly, withdrawing her hand. He returned his attention to the game, aware that they were playing for stakes far higher than wooden pieces on a checkered board. Whatever storm gathered on their horizon, they would weather it together or not at all. "Check," he said, moving his knight with newfound determination. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late April, delivered personally by station manager Wilson, who had recognized the Boston return address and official seal. "Figured this might be important, Sheriff. Came on the morning train." Colton thanked him, waiting until the door closed before breaking the wax seal. Inside, he found a detailed response to his inquiries about Edward Blackwood's Eastern business activities prior to his arrival in Redwater 12 years earlier. What he read confirmed suspicions that had been growing since his conversation with Evelyn about Blackwood's proposal. The man, who now presented himself as a pillar of frontier society, had fled Boston under investigation for investment fraud that had ruined several prominent families. Only the reluctance of his victims to publicly acknowledge their gullibility had prevented formal charges. More disturbing were the references to Blackwood's first wife, a wealthy widow whose suspicious death had been attributed to consumption despite the absence of prior symptoms. Her fortune had funded his westward journey and initial mining ventures, with enough remaining to establish him as Redwater's most prominent citizen. The final paragraphs connected to Evelyn directly, explaining that her father, a respected inventor and educator, had been among those ruined by Blackwood's schemes. The man had taken his own life shortly thereafter, leaving his daughter with little beyond patent royalties and a justifiable hatred for the man responsible. Colton set the letter down, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Evelyn had come to Redwater not randomly seeking distance from Boston society, but deliberately tracking the man who had destroyed her family. Her position at the school, the same institution Blackwood's son attended and where his influence on the town council gave him authority, placed her in perfect proximity to observe her enemy without revealing her purpose. What remained unclear was her ultimate intention: revenge, justice, public exposure. Whatever her goal, she had placed herself in the path of a man who had already escaped consequences once and would likely go to great lengths to avoid them again. The protective instinct that surged through Colton surprised him with its intensity. He needed to warn her immediately to ensure she understood the danger of her position. Yet something held him back. The recognition that Evelyn had deliberately withheld this information, had chosen not to trust him with her true purpose in Redwater. The realization stung more than he cared to admit. Before he could decide how to proceed, the door burst open without warning. Tommy Blackwood stood in the doorway, his usual sullen expression replaced by genuine fear. "Sheriff, come quick!" Barr's men caught Miss Kensington in his office. "They're taking her to the mine." Colton was on his feet and reaching for his gun belt before the boy finished speaking. When?" "Just now. I ran straight here." Tommy's face showed confusion beyond his years. Pa said she was a thief, but Miss Kensington wouldn't steal. She teaches us about honesty every day. You did right, Tommy. Colton checked his revolver, then grabbed his hat. Go to Deputy Miller at the saloon. Tell him to meet me at the North Mine entrance. Understand? The boy nodded and bolted out the door. Colton followed moments later, mounting his horse with practiced efficiency, despite the fear clutching at his throat. The North Mine lay 2 miles outside town, too far to reach quickly on foot, but a hard ride could get him there in 15 minutes. As he galloped down Main Street, scattering chickens and earning shouts from startled pedestrians, Colton's mind raced through possible scenarios. Had Evelyn discovered evidence of Blackwood's past crimes, or had she confronted him directly, driven by grief for her father? Either way, she had underestimated the man's capacity for violence when cornered. The mine entrance came into view. As he crested the final hill, a dark gash in the earth, surrounded by rough wooden structures and piles of tailings. Men milled about the yard, some looking uncomfortable, others actively preventing several women from approaching the main office building. Colton dismounted at full gallop, momentum carrying him to the office steps before the gathered miners. Fully registered his arrival, he recognized Blackwood's foreman blocking the door, arms crossed in defiance. "Move aside, Jensen," Colton ordered, hand resting on his holstered gun. "Private property, Sheriff," Jensen replied, not budging. "Mr. Blackwood's handling a personnel matter." "Miss Kensington isn't his personnel. Step aside, or I'll move you myself." Something in Colton's expression, perhaps the cold fury that had replaced his usual measured demeanor, caused Jensen to reconsider his position. He stepped aside with calculated slowness, a final show of reluctant compliance. Inside, Colton found Blackwood seated behind his desk, artificially relaxed, while 2 miners held Evelyn firmly by the arms. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and a red mark bloomed on her cheek, but her eyes, when they met Colton's, showed neither fear nor defeat, but cold determination. "Sheriff," Blackwood acknowledged without rising, "this doesn't concern you. Miss Kensington was caught stealing private documents from my office, a simple legal matter." "Then you'll file charges properly," Colton replied, his voice deadly quiet. "Release her to my custody." "I think not." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. "We handle discipline directly at Blackwood Enterprises. Saves the town the expense of a trial. There is no we in matters of law." Colton's hand remained near his weapon, though he hadn't drawn it. "Only the court and myself. Release her, now." "Or what?" Blackwood stood slowly, revealing the shotgun resting across his desk. "You'll shoot my men? Create widows and orphans over this Boston thief?" Evelyn spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite her position. "He knows, Edward, about Boston, about what you did to my father and the others." The statement hung in the air like gun smoke, transforming the standoff from a simple matter of law enforcement to something far more personal. Blackwood's expression shifted from confident control to wary calculation. "Unfortunate investments," he said after a moment. "Business failures happen every day. Nothing criminal occurred." "Tell that to my father," as he put a pistol to his head, Evelyn replied, raw pain breaking through her composed facade. "Tell that to Mrs. Winters, as she sold her home to pay debts you created through fraud. Unproven allegations from a hysterical woman." Blackwood's hand moved toward the shotgun. "Sheriff, I suggest you leave and forget this conversation. Miss Kensington will be on the afternoon train, alive, if somewhat bruised, provided we're not interrupted further." The threat crystallized everything for Colton, not just the immediate danger to Evelyn, but the choice he faced between the letter of the law and its spirit, between duty as defined by position and duty as defined by conscience. In that moment, the weight he had carried since Sarah's death seemed to lift, allowing him to see with perfect clarity. "Gentlemen," he addressed the miners holding Evelyn, I don't know what Mr. Blackwood has promised you, but ask yourselves this. How many secrets must a man keep before he'll readily commit murder to protect them? The miners exchanged uneasy glances, their grip on Evelyn loosening slightly. He's bluffing, Blackwood snapped. The sheriff stands alone. I employ half this town. Not alone. Deputy Miller's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with several armed townspeople. And seems like your employees are reconsidering their position. One of the miners, Johnson, whose daughter, sat front row in Evelyn's classroom, released her arm entirely. I signed on to dig coal, Mr. Blackwood, not to harm women or break laws. The other followed suit moments later, stepping away from Evelyn with visible relief. She immediately moved to Colton's side, her fingers briefly touching his arm in silent gratitude. Blackwood's facade crumbled as he watched his authority dissolve. With desperate speed, he grabbed for the shotgun, swinging it toward Colton and Evelyn with murderous intent. What happened next seemed to unfold in suspended time. Colton pushed Evelyn behind him with one hand while drawing his revolver with the other. His shot rang out a split second before Blackwood could fire, striking the man's shoulder and sending the shotgun blast harmlessly into the ceiling. Blackwood collapsed with a howl of pain and rage, clutching his wounded shoulder, while spewing threats and accusations. Miller and the townspeople surged forward, securing the wounded man and the dropped weapon. Amid the chaos, Colton turned to Evelyn, his hands gentle as they framed her face, examining the mark on her cheek. "Are you hurt elsewhere?" She shook, her head, emotion finally breaking through her carefully maintained control. "I'm sorry, I should have told you everything, I just—" "Later," he interrupted softly. "You're safe now. That's what matters." As they emerged from the office into bright spring sunlight, Colton kept his arm protectively around Evelyn's shoulders, no longer concerned with appearances or propriety. The gathered crowd, miners, townspeople, even Tommy Blackwood watching, wide-eyed from behind Dr. Harrison, witnessed not just the aftermath of confrontation, but the undeniable truth of what had grown between the sheriff and the schoolteacher. Together, they walked toward town, leaving behind secrets unearthed and choices made that would reshape not just their own lives, but the future of Redwater itself. May unfolded in a flurry of legal proceedings and community upheaval. Edward Blackwood, still recovering from his wound, faced multiple charges, ranging from assault to older allegations of fraud unearthed through Evelyn's persistent investigation. His mining operation continued under temporary management appointed by the town council, ensuring families dependent on those wages wouldn't suffer for their employers' crimes. Throughout these developments, Colton and Evelyn maintained a curious distance, connected through shared experience yet separated by truths still partially concealed. They spoke daily, often walking together after sunset when the town's watchful eyes had turned homeward, but their conversations carefully avoided the deepest questions that hung between them. On the last Saturday of the month, as twilight painted Redwater in shades of lavender and gold, they sat on a bench overlooking the creek. Water gurgled over stones polished smooth by time, catching the day's final light in fleeting sparkles. "The school board renewed my contract today," Evelyn said, breaking a comfortable silence. "For 2 years." Colton nodded, unsurprised yet relieved. Despite her vindication in the Blackwood affair, whispers had persisted about the propriety of retaining a teacher who had deliberately concealed her connection to a prominent citizen, however justified her reasons. "They're fortunate to keep you," he replied simply. "I had help. Mrs. Harrison championed my cause quite fiercely." Evelyn smoothed her skirt, a gesture he had come to recognize as preceding difficult subjects. "They asked if I intended to remain unmarried during my tenure." The question, expected yet loaded with implication, hung between them like a suspended note awaiting resolution. Tradition still dictated that female teachers resign upon marriage, though exceptions increasingly occurred in frontier communities where qualified educators remained scarce. "What did you tell them?" Colton kept his tone neutral despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "That my plans remained private until formally announced." She glanced sideways at him, a hint of challenge in her expression. Was that presumptuous? The opening, subtle yet unmistakable, offered Colton the opportunity he had both longed for and dreaded. 5 years of solitary grief had left him unsure of his capacity for happiness, fearful that reaching for joy might somehow dishonor Sarah's memory. Yet in recent weeks, he had begun to understand that his wife's greatest gift had been teaching him to love completely, a lesson that honored her best when applied rather than abandoned. "No," he said finally, "not presumptuous. Perhaps hopeful." Evelyn's hands stilled in her lap as she turned to face him fully. "I came to Redwater seeking justice, perhaps revenge. I never expected to find something worth staying for," he finished when she trailed off. "Yes." The simple acknowledgement contained volumes of unspoken feeling. "I never expected you, Colton." The use of his given name, still rare enough to carry significance, pulled him across the remaining distance between them. His hand covered hers, calloused fingers entwining with slender ones that had proved surprisingly strong. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. "Been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment." The small object he placed in her palm gleamed in the fading light. A key, newly forged and polished, to a soft glow. "To the schoolhouse?" she asked, confusion evident in her furrowed brow. "To my home." He met her questioning gaze steadily. It stood empty too long, waiting for life to return, like its owner. Understanding dawned in her, eyes followed by something deeper, recognition of the gift's true meaning, beyond mere metal and mechanics. The key represented not just access to physical space, but invitation to a future previously locked away. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "Your memories of Sarah will always remain precious," he interrupted gently. "But I've learned something these past months. Memories can sustain you through darkness, but they're no substitute for living in the light." Evelyn's fingers closed around the key, her other hand maintaining its connection with his. "I haven't told you everything about my past. There may be more difficulties ahead when all is revealed. I'm counting on it." The smile that crossed his face felt unfamiliar, yet right, like returning to a home long abandoned but not forgotten. Life without challenge grows stagnant. Sarah taught me that. You reminded me. The mention of his late wife in the same breath as Evelyn felt not like betrayal, but completion, acknowledgement that hearts expand rather than replace, that love compounds rather than divides. "May I call on you properly tomorrow?" he asked, suddenly aware of traditional steps they had circumvented through extraordinary circumstances. "After church?" "Yes." Her smile matched his own, tentative yet luminous with possibility. "I believe Mrs. Potter would expire from excitement if you didn't, after all the speculation she's encouraged." Laughter came easier than it had in years, shared between them as the first stars appeared overhead. They remained on the bench as darkness settled fully around them, speaking of ordinary things, school plans, town gossip, books recently arrived at Harmon's store, while their entwined hands spoke of extraordinary promise. Later, walking Evelyn to her door, Colton stopped beneath the porch lantern. Soft light illuminated her features, the strong brow, expressive eyes, mouth that had spoken truths he needed to hear and hopes he longed to share. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, hearing the depth of feeling in his own voice. "Good night, Colton," she replied, her eyes holding his for a moment that stretched beyond time. No kiss sealed their unspoken understanding, only the gentle pressure of hands reluctant to part, and the shared knowledge that tomorrow represented not just another day, but the first page of a new chapter neither had expected to write. As Colton walked home beneath a canopy of stars, he felt Sarah's presence not as a ghost that haunted, but as a blessing that endured, approval for the healing he had resisted for too long, and the future he now embraced with cautious joy. Summer arrived with unrelenting heat that baked the earth and turned the creek to a sluggish trickle. Townspeople moved with deliberate slowness, conserving energy as they adapted to the season's demands. Even criminals seemed affected by the temperature, giving Colton the quietest June in recent memory, a fortunate development that allowed him ample time for personal matters. His courtship of Evelyn proceeded with similar, unhurried deliberation. Sunday dinners at Mrs. Potter's became a regular tradition, as did Wednesday evening discussions in the parlor of what was increasingly referred to as their home rather than merely his. The transition happened so naturally that most of Redwater hardly noticed the progression from possibility to certainty. Only Evelyn maintained a curious reserve, accepting his attentions with evident pleasure, yet holding something of herself apart, a final barrier neither had directly addressed. Colton recognized the hesitation without understanding its source, patient enough to wait for revelation, yet increasingly certain that complete trust must precede any formal commitment. The catalyst came unexpectedly during Redwater's Independence Day celebration. The town gathered in the square for music, food, and evening fireworks shipped at great expense from Denver. As twilight approached, Colton and Evelyn strolled among the festivities, stopping to admire children's games and sample Mrs. Harrison's prize-winning apple tarts. "I have something to show you," Evelyn said suddenly, her fingers tightening around his arm. "At the schoolhouse. Would you mind stepping away for a moment?" Curious, Colton agreed, following her through the crowd toward the quiet building that stood dark and empty during summer vacation. Inside, the familiar classroom smelled of chalk dust and lemon oil, desks arranged in precise rows, awaiting students' return in September. Evelyn lit a lamp, then moved to her desk, where she unlocked the bottom drawer with a key produced from her pocket. From within, she withdrew a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl, an elegant object that seemed out of place among pedagogical materials. "This belonged to my mother," she explained, running her fingers over the delicate inlay. "One of the few things I have of hers. Inside is something I've kept hidden since arriving in Redwater." She hesitated, conflict evident in her expression, before resolution settled in its place. With deliberate movement, she opened the box and removed a folded document sealed with faded wax. "My marriage certificate," she said quietly, extending it toward him. Was Mrs. Evelyn Harrington of Boston, widow of Lieutenant James Harrington, 3rd Massachusetts Regiment." The revelation hung between them as Colton carefully accepted the document, breaking the seal to confirm her words. The certificate dated 6 years earlier, the ink faded but legible in the lamplight. "Why keep this secret?" he asked without accusation, refolding the paper with care. Evelyn's hands clasped before her, knuckles whitening with tension. "Because James didn't die honorably in battle, as his family claimed. He took his own life after learning of my father's suicide and our financial ruin. The Harringtons paid to have the circumstances concealed to preserve their reputation and spare me. The shame of suicide stigma." She turned away, facing the classroom window, where distant lanterns from the celebration glowed like earthbound stars. "I became the respectably tragic war widow, rather than the wife of a man who couldn't face adversity. When I learned Blackwood had settled here, that he had prospered while others he destroyed lay in graves, I saw an opportunity for justice, But I knew no one would hire a divorced woman, and few would accept a widow seeking vengeance. So you became Miss Kensington. Again, Colton concluded, understanding dawning. Reclaimed your maiden name to begin anew. Yes. She turned back to face him, vulnerability evident in her posture, yet strength undiminished in her gaze. I've deceived this town, deceived you. If that changes what's grown between us, I'll understand. The simplicity of her statement, offering, release from obligation without emotional manipulation, confirmed what Colton had known for months but never fully articulated even to himself. This woman, with her complexities and courage, had become essential to his existence in ways that transcended conventional romance. Her resilience in the face of multiple losses, her determination to create meaning from tragedy, mirrored his own journey toward healing. Sarah's favorite flowers were columbines, he said, the apparent non sequitur causing Evelyn's brow to furrow in confusion. They grew wild behind our house. I couldn't look at them after she died. Had Deputy Miller. Dig them all up and burn them. Couldn't bear the reminder. He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her eyes. This spring they came back. Different spot, near the creek. First time I saw them blooming, I waited for the pain, the guilt of still being here when she isn't, but instead I felt something else. What? Evelyn's voice barely carried the distance between them. Gratitude. He reached for her hand, enfolding it between both of his, for having loved her, for still being alive to see beauty return to the world, for finding someone who understands that grief shapes but doesn't define us. Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes, though none fell. You're not angry about my deception. Would be a poor lawman if I didn't understand why people hide parts of themselves. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Would be a poorer man if I couldn't recognize courage when I see it. The distance between them dissolved as Evelyn stepped into his embrace, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin, as though designed by Providence for exactly this connection. They stood in silence, heartbeats synchronizing as the first distant explosions of fireworks punctuated the summer evening. When Evelyn finally spoke, her words vibrated against his chest. What happens now? Colton's answer came without hesitation or doubt. Now we stop letting the past determine our future. Together. The certificate remained on the desk as they left the schoolhouse hand in hand, returning to the celebration not as sheriff and schoolteacher, but as man and woman who had traversed separate wildernesses of loss to find unexpected companionship on the other side. Above them, fireworks painted the sky in ephemeral blooms of color and light, each brief, brilliant, and unrepeatable, like moments of perfect understanding between two souls no longer alone. Autumn painted red water in russet and gold, transforming the landscape into a canvas of transition. Cottonwood leaves drifted like yellow coins upon the creek's surface, and morning frost silvered the boardwalks until midday sun reclaimed dominion. Nature's display of beautiful impermanence seemed particularly fitting as Colton and Evelyn prepared for their own transformation. They had announced their engagement in late August, to the surprise of precisely no one in town. Mrs. Potter immediately volunteered her home for the reception, while Reverend Palmer offered the church and his services without being asked. The wedding was scheduled for the first Saturday in October, soon enough to precede winter's arrival, yet distant enough to allow proper preparations. On the morning before their wedding, Colton rose before dawn and rode to the cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Sarah's grave stood beneath the oak tree, the simple marker softened by years of weather, and surrounded now by late-blooming wildflowers. Someone, likely Mrs. Harrison, who had been Sarah's closest friend, had planted. In a gesture of remembrance, he dismounted and approached with reverence born not of grief but gratitude. The ritualistic visits that had once structured his existence had gradually decreased as healing progressed. Yet this final pilgrimage before beginning his new life seemed essential to completion. "I came to say goodbye," he spoke aloud, his voice startling a nearby meadowlark into flight. "Not to your memory, that remains with me always, but to the man who's been living half a life since losing you." The morning breeze rustled oak leaves overhead, nature's gentle acknowledgement of words meant for absent ears. Colton removed his hat, holding it against his chest as he continued. "You told me once that love multiplies rather than divides. Didn't understand then what you meant." He smiled at the memory of Sarah's philosophical musings that had often stretched his practical mind. "Think I do now. Loving Evelyn doesn't diminish what we shared. It honors it. Shows I learned how to recognize what matters." From his pocket, he withdrew a small object that caught the early sunlight, Sarah's wedding ring, which he had kept in his desk drawer since her death. With careful movements, he knelt and pressed it into the earth at the base of her headstone, a symbol returning to the elements as life continued its eternal cycle. "Thank you," he whispered, the simple words encompassing all he had received and all he had lost, the completeness of a love that had shaped him into the man capable of loving again. As he rose, Colton noticed movement at the cemetery entrance. Evelyn, standing beside her own horse, maintaining respectful distance while witnessing his private farewell. Their eyes met across the grass, mutual understanding flowing between them without need for explanation or justification. She approached only when he nodded invitation, her steps careful among the markers until she reached his side. Without speaking, she slipped her hand into his, her presence neither intruding upon his moment with Sarah nor remaining separate from it, a bridge between past and future that acknowledged the continuity of his journey. "She would have liked you," Colton said finally, breaking the companionable silence. "Always said I needed someone who'd challenge my certainties." "I wish I could have known her." Evelyn's voice held genuine regret rather than perfunctory politeness. "The woman who first taught you to see beyond the badge must have been remarkable indeed." "She was," he squeezed Evelyn's hand gently. "Different from you in many ways, but similar in what matters most. Strength that doesn't require display, kindness that expects nothing in return." Together they stood before Sarah's grave for several minutes more, the rising sun warming their shoulders as birds began their morning chorus in nearby trees. No awkwardness shadowed the moment, only peaceful recognition that love's capacity for renewal represented not replacement, but continuation. As they turned to leave, Evelyn paused, removing something from her pocket, a small silver music box that had become her talisman through difficult transitions. She wound it carefully, then placed it on the headstone, where soft notes of the waltz drifted into the morning air. "A gift," she explained simply, "from one who understands the journey to the one who began it." The gesture, acknowledging Sarah not as predecessor to be erased, but as essential chapter in their shared story, moved Colton beyond words. He gathered Evelyn gently into his arms, their embrace witnessed only by ancient oak and endless sky, as the music box played its delicate melody to completion. When they rode back toward town, something had shifted subtly yet profoundly between them. The final barriers of unspoken fear dissolved in mutual recognition that each brought not half but whole hearts to their union, enriched rather than diminished by previous joys and sorrows. That evening, their last before becoming husband and wife, they sat on the porch of their home, watching sunset paint the western sky in impossible colors. No grand declarations or passionate embraces marked the moment. only the quiet certainty of two people who had traveled difficult terrain to find unexpected treasure, the courage to begin again. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Evelyn asked, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. Colton considered the question not as mere inquiry about wedding preparations, but as deeper examination of his readiness to step fully into a future. Once thought impossible, his answer came without hesitation or doubt. "I've been ready since the day you stepped down from that stagecoach," he replied, simple truth requiring no embellishment. Just took time to recognize it. The town bell rang in the distance, marking the day's end and tomorrow's promise with the same steady rhythm. Like the badge he still wore and the responsibilities he still carried, some constants remained. Yet within that framework of continuity, everything had changed, transformed by the recognition that duty without connection equaled existence rather than life. As stars emerged overhead, Colton and Evelyn remained on the porch in comfortable silence, two souls no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had found. The courage to recognize love when it arrived in unexpected form, and the wisdom to embrace it without reservation. The wedding took place as planned on that first Saturday in October, the church filled beyond capacity as Redwater gathered to witness the union of their sheriff and schoolteacher. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting jewel-toned patterns across simple decorations of autumn leaves and white chrysanthemums. Deputy Miller stood as best man, Mrs. Harrison as matron of honor. Positions that acknowledged the small circle of true friendship both bride and groom had cultivated. Evelyn wore not traditional white, but a gown the color of sage, adorned with delicate embroidery. She had completed herself during summer evenings on the porch. Around her neck hung a simple silver chain, bearing her mother's wedding ring, a private connection to her past as she embraced her future. In her hands she carried columbines, preserved from their spring blooming, their blue petals faded to gentle lavender, but their form intact. Colton waited at the altar in his finest suit, the badge temporarily absent from his chest. Today he stood not as sheriff, but simply as man. When Evelyn appeared in the doorway, his expression of quiet wonder was noted by every witness as confirmation that second chances at happiness were indeed possible, even for those who had walked through fire and emerged transformed. Reverend Palmer spoke of covenant rather than contract, of partnership rather than possession, his words reflecting the authentic relationship already established between bride and groom. When the moment came for vows, neither Colton nor Evelyn relied on traditional formulations. Instead, each spoke from the heart, their promises simple yet profound in their honesty. "I bring to you not perfection, but wholeness," Evelyn said, her clear voice carrying to the farthest pew. "Not innocence, but wisdom earned through loss. I promise to walk beside you through whatever terrain lies ahead, to challenge when necessary, to support when needed, to love without reservation even when the path grows steep. I offer you not a life without struggle, but a partner who will face each challenge at your side." Colton responded, his usual reserve softened by evident emotion. "I promise to see you fully, past, present, and future, and to nurture the growth of both the person you are and the person you are becoming. Where I once defined myself by duty alone, I now find purpose in our connection and possibility in our shared journey." As they exchanged rings, simple bands that symbolized commitment without extravagance, something beyond the ordinary seemed to fill the small church. Those present would later describe it differently. Mrs. Potter claimed the light changed quality, becoming almost tangible. Deputy Miller swore he heard distant music, though no instruments played. Dr. Harrison simply noted that for a moment everyone breathed in perfect unison, as though the congregation itself had become a single organism witnessing something sacred. Whatever the explanation, when Reverend Palmer pronounced them husband And wife, the moment transcended mere social convention or legal status. Something fundamental had been acknowledged, not just the union of two individuals, but the triumph of renewal over resignation, of hope over history, of love's persistent bloom in soil once thought barren. The celebration afterward filled Mrs. Potter's home and spilled into her garden, where tables groaned under potluck contributions from throughout the community. Children played tag between clusters of conversing adults. Dogs slept beneath tables. Awaiting fallen scraps and music from fiddles and guitars created an ever-changing soundtrack to the festivities. As evening approached, Colton and Evelyn slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand toward the creek where their most honest conversations had often unfolded. October's early twilight painted the landscape in soft focus, blurring boundaries between earth and sky as stars emerged overhead. They stopped at the familiar bench overlooking water that gurgled eternal reassurance of continuity amid change. Fallen leaves swirled in small eddies, gold against dark water, beauty in transition rather than stasis. "Mrs. Reeves," Colton said, testing the sound of her new name in the gathering darkness. "Sheriff," she replied with quiet amusement, her hand still fitted perfectly within his larger one. No further words seemed necessary as they sat together, watching night claim the landscape while distant sounds of their wedding celebration created a cocoon of community around their private moment. The journey that had brought them together, through loss and loneliness, through secrets and surrender, through patience and painful honesty, had prepared them for this threshold between what had been and what might yet be. Behind them lay separate pasts made bearable through sharing. Before them stretched a common future containing unknown challenges and joys. Between these territories existed only the present moment, breathing together beneath October stars, alive to possibility in all its terrifying beauty. As full darkness settled around them, Evelyn reached into her pocket and produced the silver music box that had become symbol of their evolving connection. She wound it carefully, then opened the lid to release its delicate melody into the night air. Without speaking, she rose and extended her hand in invitation. Colton accepted without hesitation, drawing her into his arms as they began to waltz. Beside the creek, guided by starlight and music box melody, their movements, initially cautious, gradually confident, traced patterns across earth, still holding summer's warmth beneath autumn's cooling breath. No witnesses observed this private celebration except night creatures and ancient stars. No words interrupted the music that enveloped them in temporary enchantment. In this moment between moments, they needed no audience or affirmation, only the recognition that in each other they had found not completion, but continuation, not escape from the past, but incorporation of its lessons into a present rich with possibility. When the music box completed its song, they remained in motion for several heartbeats more, reluctant to break the spell of connection. Finally, they stilled, foreheads touching in a gesture more intimate than passion, more honest than proclamation. "Ready to go home?" Colton asked, the question encompassing far more than physical destination. "Yes," Evelyn replied, simple syllable containing multitudes of meaning. "I've been ready for longer than I knew." Hand in hand, they walked toward town, toward the house that had waited for life's return, toward a future neither had imagined, possible in their separate darknesses. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal journey toward distant ocean, carrying fallen leaves toward transformation, golden messengers of nature's endless cycle of renewal. Above them, stars maintained their ancient vigil, witnessing yet another story of human resilience unfolding beneath their unchanging light. Two souls who had learned that love's greatest power lay not in immunity from suffering, but in the courage to remain open despite it, in the wisdom to recognize that hearts, like abandoned gardens, could bloom again when tended with patience and unflinching hope.